On March 17, 1943, in a quiet wood-paneled office tucked away in Berlin, a German admiral examined a report that seemed utterly impossible. It was nothing more than a single sheet of paper, a concise compilation of raw intelligence. Yet the information it carried had the potential to be more destructive than a massive bomb. The report did not reveal a new superweapon, a secret army, or some hidden technological marvel. Instead, it described a single factory, an American factory located across the Atlantic, which was expected to soon produce a four-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men of the German High Command, it seemed preposterous, almost laughably a piece of propaganda, so absurd it could not be true. Yet for the spies who had risked their lives to obtain these details, it was something much grimmer. It was a numerical death sentence, a sign that the war had already slipped out of Germany's grasp. That day marked the moment they realized with cold, undeniable certainty that defeat was inevitable. This is the story of the dreadful truth too terrifying for Hitler to acknowledge, and how his refusal to confront a single fact ultimately sealed the fate of the Third Reich. Within the Nazi military hierarchy, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an anomaly. As head of the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, he lived and breathed the hard reality of facts rather than ideology. Unlike the fanatics populating Hitler's inner circle, Canaris was a professional of the old school, a career naval officer, and a patriot whose perspective had been shaped by duty and strategic clarity rather than the distorted lens of political fanaticism. His loyalty was to Germany itself, and his obligation was to deliver the unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly or unwelcome it might be. Under his leadership, the Abwehr had become a vast network of agents and analysts spanning the globe, serving as the vigilant eyes and ears of the German military. In the early years of the war, the organization had been instrumental to Germany's rapid blitzkrieg victories, supplying the intelligence that allowed the Wehrmacht to outmaneuver its enemies and seize territory with precision. By early 1943, however, the atmosphere in Berlin had shifted. The war no longer consisted of a sequence of triumphs and celebrations. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad had shaken the nation to its core, delivering a brutal shock to the German military and civilian psyche alike. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly, demonstrating an unstoppable and terrifying strength. Meanwhile, in North Africa, American and British troops were systematically crushing Rommel's once feared Afrika Korps, strangling its resources and morale. The momentum of the war was turning, yet at the top echelons of power, a dangerous illusion of invincibility lingered. Hitler, ensconced in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, grew increasingly isolated from reality, surrounded by advisors and sycophants who filtered out any bad news and reinforced his delusions. He clung to the belief that victory was inevitable, that the German soldier was inherently superior, and that German science was unbeatable. In his mind, triumph was simply destiny. Into this bubble of self-deception, Canaris was about to deliver a shock of undeniable clarity. He understood the harsh mathematics of modern war, recognizing it not merely as a clash of armies, but as a brutal confrontation of entire economies. Success was measured in steel, oil, aluminum, and the relentless capacity to produce weapons of war. From his vantage point, at the center of a vast intelligence network, he began to perceive data that filled him with dread. The numbers suggested that Germany was not merely struggling, it was on the verge of being crushed by an industrial might it could scarcely comprehend. The intelligence did not arrive suddenly. It emerged gradually, piece by piece, like a creeping sense of doom. It began with faint whispers picked up by German agents operating in neutral countries. Reports trickled in from businessmen returning from the United States, describing factories so immense they seemed to have their own climate. Diplomats in Washington relayed details of production targets so staggering they appeared inflated, almost fantastical. A Swedish engineer sent coded communications describing aircraft assembly lines moving at speeds previously only seen in automobile manufacturing. Taken individually, each report could be dismissed as exaggeration or error. Yet when analyzed together at Abwehr headquarters, the pattern became horrifyingly clear. All the reports pointed to a single, massive industrial complex in Michigan, known as Willow Run. Every account described the same improbable feat. Ford Motor Company was applying automobile mass production methods to the B-2 for Liberator, a massive four-engine heavy bomber. The goal was not one bomber per day, or even per few hours, but a fully completed plane every single hour. To the German mind, this seemed utterly impossible. The B-2 for Liberator was a technological behemoth, weighing 18 tons and comprising over 1.5 million individual parts. Even Germany's most advanced factories required weeks, sometimes months, to assemble a comparable heavy bomber. The idea that Americans, a nation portrayed in Nazi propaganda as chaotic, racially mixed, and fundamentally disorganized, could accomplish such a feat in an hour was not just unbelievably, was an affront to their sense of superiority. Canaris and his team ran the numbers meticulously. 1 bomber per hour translated to 24 per day, over 700 in a single month, all from a single factory. At that time, the entire German aircraft industry was barely producing a fraction of that number. Confirmation poured in from multiple sources. Allied spies corroborated the details, and even Japanese naval attaches. Germany's own allies reported on American production numbers with palpable alarm. The data was beyond question, yet the results were incomprehensible. How could a democracy, messy and diverse, mobilize so efficiently? Nazi ideology insisted that strength derived from racial purity and authoritarian disciplining qualities America lacked entirely. To acknowledge the truth would mean admitting that the war had shifted from the battlefield to the factories. As one Abwehr officer remarked, if these numbers were accurate, Germany had already lost. The question was no longer about courage or willpower, but about mathematics. And in that calculus, Germany was doomed. Half a world away, the impossible was becoming a stark reality. On a stretch of farmland in Michigan, a colossal industrial machine had been constructed. The Willow Run bomber plant rose as a monument to American industrial might, embodying what President Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. Designed by the renowned industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main building was a single enormous hall. So vast it was considered the largest enclosed space ever constructed by humans. It stretched for more than half a mile, containing within it the machinery, workers, and assembly lines that would turn out one B-24 Liberator after another with relentless precision. The scale, organization, and efficiency of Willow Run were unlike anything seen anywhere else on Earth. A terrifying testament to the power of industrial modern warfare. The implications were catastrophic for Germany. While the Wehrmacht fought on multiple fronts and soldiers endured unimaginable hardship, the Americans were producing weapons at a speed that made the German war effort seem hopelessly inadequate. Canaris realized that this was not simply a matter of battlefield tactics or military strategy. The war had already been decided by production capacity, by the sheer ability to turn raw materials into machines of war. Every report from Willow Run confirmed what the spies had feared. Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility, was an inevitability. The war had entered a new phase, one in which industrial power dictated outcomes. And in this realm, Germany could not compete. Even as the Nazi regime clung to ideology and faith in the German soldier, the cold arithmetic of factories was determining the fate of the Third Reich. The chilling truth was that Germany's enemies were not only fighting on the battlefield, they were fighting in the factories, in the assembly lines, in the raw materials, and in the relentless efficiency of production. Willow Run represented the apex of this new kind of warfare. A factory that could create weapons faster than Germany could ever hope to match. Each completed B-24 was a step closer to the eventual collapse of the German war machine. A single hour marking a victory that German generals could not counter with tanks, planes, or manpower alone. Canaris and his team understood the significance. The tide had turned irrevocably, and no amount of courage, strategy, or ideology could reverse it. The numbers told the unflinching truth, and in that truth lay the death knell of the Third Reich. To avoid paying taxes across two counties, the assembly line at Willow Run had to make a strange 90-degree turn, with partially assembled bombers rotating on massive turntables, a maneuver that came to be called the tax turn. Yet the true revolution was not in the machinery, but in the production philosophy behind it. Henry Ford and his production manager, Charles Sorensen, had made a bold promise. They would manufacture airplanes using the same principles that produced the Model T. The traditional aircraft industry laughed at the idea. You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight, one executive mocked. Ford and Sorensen proved them wrong. They broke the B-24 down into smaller sub-assemblies and trained each worker to perform a single repetitive task. One person drilled holes, another riveted panels, turning thousands of novices into competent laborers every week. The workforce itself defied the prejudices of the time and the ideology of the Nazis. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people, nearly a third of them women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who operated rivet guns and welding torches with skill and speed. One of these women, Roswell Monroe, became the real-life inspiration for the Rosie propaganda figure. The plant staff was a mosaic of American society. More than 9% were African-American. Another 3% were classified as disabled, all working side by side in shifts, 6 days a week. Their combined effort created a constant, relentless hum of production. This diverse, industrious workforce, the very mongrel society Hitler ridiculed, was about to outproduce Germany at a rate that seemed impossible. The early days of the plant were chaotic, earning it the nickname Will It Run. But by late 1943, the operation reached peak efficiency. Raw materials entered one end of the plant, and an 18-ton B-24 heavy bomber emerged fully assembled and ready for flight at the other. This was no propaganda. It represented a new type of warfare, one waged with industrial power. America had discovered a weapon the Third Reich could not counter. While German scientists obsessed over futuristic rockets, the Americans were perfecting the most devastating weapon of all: mass production. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Canaris faced his most difficult challenge, breaking through the ideological fortress surrounding Adolf Hitler. This fortress was reinforced by arrogance, willful ignorance, and the influence of Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in Germany. As head of the Luftwaffe and a flamboyant World War I ace, Göring considered himself the ultimate authority on air power. He was also corrupt and egotistical, responsible for cultivating the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris presented the Abwehr's findings on Willow Run, Göring did not react with concern but with derision. Americans cannot build airplanes, he scoffed. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades. That statement was more than a quip. It summed up the Nazi worldview. Americans were seen as shopkeepers, a decadent, racially mixed society without discipline or martial spirit. The idea that such a nation could mass-produce a heavy bomber was inconceivable. So the reports were dismissed as clumsy propaganda. For Canaris, this was maddening. He was offering mathematical certainty to a man living in fantasy. He tried to emphasize the specifics: the mile-long assembly lines, specialized tools, an immense capital investment, but Göring refused to listen. He and his inner circle clung to their narrative, and challenging it was considered heresy. Accepting Canaris's report would have been a personal admission of failure for Göring, an acknowledgement that the Luftwaffe was about to be overwhelmed. Consequently, the report was buried beneath Göring's immense ego, and the wall of denial remained intact. Canaris was left with the truth that could have saved Germany, but no one in power was willing to hear it. The final step was to present the information directly to Hitler. Approaching the Führer was perilous. Whether at the Berghof in the Alps or the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, his headquarters were oppressive, paranoid environments where reality was whatever Hitler declared it to be. Briefings reinforced his beliefs rather than challenged them. Into this theater of delusion, the facts from Willow Run were a ticking time bomb. Hitler's perception of the United States was a contradictory mix of contempt and begrudging acknowledgement of its size. He saw the nation as racially impure and manipulated by Jewish finance. Confronted with the production figures from Willow Run, 1 bomber per hour, over 650 per month, Hitler reacted with fury, interpreting them as an affront to his ideology. The numbers could only be inflated fantasies, he believed, part of a Jewish conspiracy. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, understood the implications. In later interrogations, he admitted that even if the Willow Run figures were only half accurate, Germany was doomed. But in Hitler's presence in 1943, voicing such a reality was suicidal. The confrontation between fact and ideology never occurred. Dogma always prevailed in the Third Reich. Canaris's warning was dismissed not as valuable intelligence, but as defeatism. Those who brought the truth were deemed weak, their loyalty questioned. In Hitler's worldview, the war was a test of will and blood, not logistics or production. A single sheet of paper, the result of countless spies' work, was brushed aside, ignoring the most critical strategic fact of the war. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing faster than Germany could possibly match. The decision was not made by reason, but by refusal to see. The spies were disregarded, the admiral silenced, and in that moment of ideological blindness, the fate of millions was sealed. The consequences of ignoring Willow Run were unavoidable. First came distant rumbles, then a deafening roar over the skies of the Reich. Believing their own hype, the German high command committed blunders, pouring resources into Hitler's so-called wonder weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, though advanced, were strategically marginal. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Meanwhile, the prophecy of Willow Run was coming true. By late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became a torrent. The USA's Air Force initiated relentless daylight bombing raids. And at the heart of this offensive were the B-24 Liberators. The aircraft, rolling off the assembly lines in Michigan, were now dominating the German skies. In February 1944, the Allies launched Bigwig, a concentrated campaign targeting Germany's aircraft industry, signaling the full force of the industrial war that Germany had so stubbornly ignored. As 1944 progressed, the relentless output from Willow Run and other American factories began to overwhelm the German war machine. Every day, new waves of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses took to the skies, their numbers multiplying faster than the Luftwaffe could counter. The Allied bombing campaign, meticulously planned and executed, targeted German factories, transportation networks, and oil refineries with devastating precision. Yet the scale of American production ensured that losses were quickly replaced. Entire squadrons of bombers could be lost in a single raid. And yet, the factories in Michigan and across the United States kept turning out replacements, each one indistinguishable from the last, each one another step closer to strategic dominance. Germany's forces were caught in a deadly race, and every day they fell further behind. Hitler and his generals could no longer rely on ideology or valor alone. The Luftwaffe, once considered invincible, struggled to defend the Reich skies against the overwhelming numbers of American aircraft. Pilots flew on increasingly dangerous missions, often facing exhaustion, shortages of fuel, and aging or insufficient aircraft. The technological marvels Germany had invested in jets, rockets, and advanced bombers arrived too late. In too few numbers to change the balance of power. Each innovation was eclipsed by the sheer volume of bombers rolling off American assembly lines, a testament to the deadly effectiveness of industrialized warfare. Canaris's warnings, if they had been heeded years earlier, might have shifted priorities and resources. But in 1944, the Third Reich was locked in a struggle it could not win. The psychological impact on Germany was profound. Cities that had been untouched for years suddenly became targets of near-daily bombing. Factories, rail yards, and ports were destroyed or disabled. Yet every raid only seemed to fuel American production. The workforce at Willow Run and other plants did not rest, did not pause, did not falter. While Germany's industrial and military leadership was paralyzed by arrogance and denial, the Allies understood that control of the sky depended on endless output, on precision, coordination, and human endurance. Factories became the new front lines, and production lines became the ultimate weapons of war. Meanwhile, the human story behind Willow Run was equally remarkable. Tens of thousands of workers labored in shifts that spanned nearly the entire week, performing repetitive, physically demanding tasks with unerring skill. Women handled riveting and welding with speed that matched men in the factory. African Americans and immigrants operated machinery and assembly stations with the same precision, and disabled workers contributed wherever possible. These individuals, often overlooked in broader histories of the war, were the backbone of the industrial effort, embodying a democratic ideal of collective action, skill, and ingenuity that stood in stark contrast to the authoritarian, hierarchical society of Nazi Germany. Their labor turned raw metal into aircraft that would dominate the European skies and accelerate the Reich's collapse. By mid-1944, the full consequences of ignoring Willow Run were clear. The German war economy could not keep pace with the flood of Allied aircraft and the destruction they caused. Oil depots burned, railway lines were severed, and critical infrastructure was crippled. German industry could no longer replace its losses, while every American bomber lost in combat was quickly replaced by another, indistinguishable and just as lethal. The strategic picture was undeniable. The war had shifted decisively from battles on the ground to battles of production and logistics, and Germany was losing. The failure to recognize this reality years earlier, the stubborn adherence to ideology over fact, and the dismissal of Admiral Canaris's intelligence had made defeat inevitable, even as Allied forces launched Operation Overlord in June 1944. Opening a new front in Western Europe, the impact of Willow Run remained central. The bombers produced in Michigan ensured air superiority for the Allies, enabling the safe landing and support of ground troops in France. They disrupted German reinforcements, supply lines, and industrial production, making the advance of Allied armies possible and minimizing their own casualties. Each bomber that rolled off the production line was a force multiplier, a single tangible demonstration of the strategic power that comes from industrial capacity. In retrospect, the story of Willow Run is not only a story of machines and assembly lines but of human ingenuity, coordination, and resilience. It illustrates a profound truth about modern warfare. The ability to produce, organize, and sustain an industrial effort can determine the outcome of a global conflict. While Hitler and his generals clung to ideology, arrogance, and outdated concepts of superiority, the Allies understood that victory depended on relentless execution, inclusion, and the effective harnessing of human and material resources. In the end, the very factors Hitler had dismissed, the industriousness of a diverse, democratic society, became the decisive weapon, a force that the Third Reich could neither comprehend nor counter, and a key reason why the war ended in Allied victory. Tens of thousands of bombers, many produced at Willow Run, relentlessly struck targets across Germany, reducing entire factories to ruins. The Luftwaffe scrambled to defend its homeland but was systematically overwhelmed. German pilots fought bravely, yet sheer numbers and production capacity made their efforts futile. For every fighter shot down, replacement planes were scarce, while every American bomber lost was quickly replaced by 10 more crossing the Atlantic. It was exactly the war of attrition Canaris had predicted. Cities that Hermann Göring had sworn would never be touched were being flattened. One Luftwaffe general, frustrated with Göring's detachment, wrote in his diary that the Reichsmarschall lived in a fantasy world. Just the previous day, 1,000 American bombers had destroyed Linz, yet Göring insisted it was impossible that so many planes had been built. The B-24s emerging from the massive halls of Willow Run were dismantling the Third Reich piece by piece. Factories were shattered, railways torn apart, and oil refineries obliterated. The German war machine, deprived of fuel, began to stall. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was being crushed, not by soldiers in the field, but by the relentless output of a single factory, whose leaders had mocked it. For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the consequences of telling the truth were steep. As the tide turned against Germany, his sober warnings made him suspect in Hitler's eyes. In the paranoid court of the Führer, realism was often interpreted as disloyalty. His enemies in the SS considered him part of an old-world aristocratic cabal, insufficiently devoted to Nazi ideology. They monitored him, waiting for a misstep, and his precise reports on American production were dismissed as evidence he was spreading enemy propaganda. Canaris was trapped. To perform his duty meant appearing unfaithful, yet his resistance went even deeper. Appalled by SS atrocities, he used the Abwehr to protect members of the German resistance, including the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He secretly sabotaged Nazi diplomacy, working to keep Spain from joining the Axis, an act that cost Hitler strategically. After the failed July 20, 1944, assassination attempt on Hitler, the Gestapo investigation uncovered extensive networks of opposition, many tracing back to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested, and his personal diaries revealed the true depth of his dissent. On April 9, 1945, in the war's chaotic final weeks, Hitler personally ordered his execution. At Flossenburg concentration camp, Wilhelm Canaris, stripped bare, was slowly strangled with piano wire. It was a cruel and humiliating end for a man who had seen the future with remarkable clarity. The regime he had sought to save from blindness murdered him for delivering the truth. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the numbers vindicated Canaris completely. The report he had received in 1943 had underestimated the scale. At its peak in 1944, Willow Run produced a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. By the end of its production, the plant had completed 6,970 to B-24s and supplied another 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. One factory alone had outproduced the entire German aircraft industry in four-engine heavy bombers. Across the United States, over 18,400 B-24s were produced, making it the most mass-produced heavy bomber in history. From 1940 to 1945, American factories manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft, compared to roughly 94,000 combat planes produced by Germany in the same period. As industrialist William S. Knudsen remarked, victory came because the Allies overwhelmed the enemy with an avalanche of production, the likes of which Germany had never imagined. The failure was not an intelligence gathering. German agents had reported the numbers accurately. The failure lay in belief. The leadership's inability to accept facts that contradicted their ideological narrative led to a catastrophic cognitive collapse. Nazi leaders, blinded by their own propaganda, could not fathom the scale of American industry. They were defeated not by secret weapons but by mathematics and sustained production. The men and women whom Hitler had disparaged, working in a diverse and free society, produced the tools that crushed the Reich. The spies had been correct. The admiral had been correct. Yet March 17, 1943, passed in Berlin without anyone in power willing to listen. The story of Willow Run demonstrates that history is often decided far from the battlefield, in quiet offices where a single piece of paper can determine the fate of millions. It is a stark reminder of how any government, any institution, or even an individual can be blinded by ideology and prejudice. The Third Reich fell not because it lacked information, but because its leaders refused to accept inconvenient truths. They constructed their worldview on the unstable foundation of racial mythology, and when confronted by the relentless arithmetic of production, that entire structure collapsed. The clash between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant denials of Hitler and Göring was a struggle for the soul of the German war effort. Evidence and reality faced fantasy and ideology, and fantasy won, dooming the Reich. Willow Run stands as a monument to the forces that Nazism sought to suppress, the power of a diverse, free society to innovate, organize, and achieve what authoritarianism cannot. The factory floor, chaotic and messy, yet astonishingly productive, was a microcosm of the Allied cause. People of all backgrounds, working together with ingenuity and purpose, accomplished the impossible. The lesson endures. The most formidable barriers are not physical but mental, the walls we erect in our own minds. When reality collides with ideology, it is often the ideology that falls, but only if we are willing to see the truth. By late 1944, the effects of Willow Run were undeniable. The plant's B-2 for Liberators, along with other American aircraft, dominated the European skies, enabling the Allies to maintain near-total air superiority. Daylight bombing raids devastated German industry, striking factories, oil depots, and transportation hubs with precision and overwhelming force. Each raid was compounded by the sheer volume of aircraft the Americans could produce. For every bomber lost, several more were ready to take its place. Germany's capacity to respond was collapsing. Pilots flew increasingly desperate missions, often facing overwhelming numbers of enemy aircraft, insufficient fuel, and aging or poorly maintained planes. Technological marvels like the Me-262 jet and V-2 rocket arrived too late to alter the balance of power. Meanwhile, Willow Run continued, churning out bombers at an astonishing pace, ensuring that every American loss was rapidly replaced, and every German defensive victory was fleeting. The psychological toll on Germany was immense. Cities that had been relatively untouched were now shattered. Civilians endured constant air raids, and vital infrastructure crumbled. The once mighty Luftwaffe could no longer protect key industrial centers or maintain supply lines. As German factories burned and rail networks were destroyed, the ability to sustain an effective war effort diminished rapidly. The Third Reich was being consumed not by heroic battles on the ground, but by the relentless arithmetic of industrial production, a lesson that Canaris had tried to communicate years earlier, only to be ignored. The human story behind Willow Run remained extraordinary. Tens of thousands of workers, many with no previous experience in aviation, labored in shifts that spanned nearly every day of the week. Women operated riveting guns, welding torches, and assembly machinery with precision and speed equal to their male counterparts. African Americans, immigrants, and disabled workers joined the effort, forming a diverse and cooperative workforce that defied the racial and ideological prejudices of Nazi Germany. Together, they transformed raw materials into formidable war machines, embodying a democratic ideal of collective effort, ingenuity, and resilience. Their contribution, though often overlooked in broader narratives of the war, was decisive in ensuring Allied dominance in the air. The contrast between Willow Run and Germany's industrial efforts could not have been starker. German factories, constrained by hierarchical rigidity, slow innovation, and an unwillingness to fully integrate diverse labor, produced aircraft in far smaller numbers. Even advanced technologies like rockets, jets, and super-heavy bombers could not compensate for the lack of sheer output. Willow Run's assembly lines demonstrated a principle that became central to modern warfare: the ability to mobilize, organize, and sustain an industrial effort often determines the outcome of global conflicts. Every bomber that rolled off the line represented more than metal and fuel. It represented a decisive shift in strategic balance, a tangible measure of industrial supremacy. By early 1945, the cumulative impact of American production was clear. Allied bombers, powered by the relentless output from Willow Run and similar factories, dominated the skies and disrupted Germany's ability to fight effectively. The Reich's railways, refineries, and factories lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe was depleted, and every remaining pilot faced overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, the soldiers on the ground, deprived of supplies, fuel, and reinforcements, struggled to resist the advancing Allied forces. The dominoes were falling, exactly as Canaris had predicted. The industrial might of the United States was dismantling the Third Reich systematically, piece by piece. The story of Canaris himself remained tragic but illustrative. He had seen the future clearly, understood the consequences of industrial disparity, and tried to warn those in power. His intelligence and insight, if heeded, might have allowed Germany to prioritize and adapt, possibly prolonging the war. Instead, the combination of arrogance, ideological blindness, and personal ego, most prominently from Hitler and Gringe, ensured that reality was ignored. Canaris paid the ultimate price for his honesty and foresight, executed brutally in the war's final weeks. His warnings, however, were vindicated by history. The very factory he had tracked and analyzed had become one of the decisive factors in Germany's defeat. When the war ended in May 1945, the scale of American industrial achievement was staggering. Willow Run alone had produced nearly 7,000 complete B-24 Liberators and supplied almost 2,000 additional kits for assembly elsewhere. Across the United States, over 18,400 B-24s were built, making it the most mass-produced heavy bomber in history. The total American aircraft output during the war exceeded 300,000 planes. While Germany managed approximately 94,000 combat aircraft, the numerical and logistical superiority of the Allies had created a force that Germany could neither match nor hope to overcome. It was not secret weapons or daring tactics that broke the Reich, but the consistent, relentless work of factories and the people who ran them. The truth that Canaris had recognized years earlier. Willow Run became a symbol of the power inherent in a free, diverse, and cooperative society. Its workforce, women, minorities, immigrants, and the disabled, demonstrated that collective human effort, when organized and mobilized, could achieve what totalitarian systems could only dream of. The factory's success was a living rebuke to Nazi ideology, a proof that diversity and ingenuity could outperform rigid hierarchy and prejudice. The massive halls where B-24s were assembled were more than industrial sites. They were monuments to human cooperation and the decisive impact of production in modern warfare. The lessons of Willow Run extend far beyond World War II. They remind us that intelligence is only as valuable as the willingness of leadership to act upon it. They show that ideological rigidity can blind even the most powerful leaders to reality. Most importantly, they demonstrate that the collective labor of ordinary people, united by purpose and organized efficiently, can reshape the course of history. March 17, 1943, the day Canaris first received the report on Willow Run, marks a moment when knowledge and foresight collided with prejudice and denial. A collision